Hey, family, and welcome back to another week on Guns and Butter with your favorite cousin, Kinda G. Per usual, I hope y'all had an amazing week, but I also hope y'all are ready to get into part 2 from last week's episode. I heard y'all was looking for me. But before I get into part 2, y'all know it's still February, so I gotta give y'all a Guns and Butter Black History fun fact. Okay, let's jump right into it. Did y'all know in 1921, an entire city in Oklahoma was burned to the ground due to a racial disturbance and retaliation? This was known as the Tulsa Race Riot. So, following World War I, Tulsa was recognized nationally for its abundance of African American community and culture, and this was known as the Greenwood District. The thriving business district and surrounding residential area was referred to as Black Wall Street. But in June of 1921, a series of events occurred that nearly destroyed the entire Greenwood area. Now, that's something I did not know. I've always heard about Black Wall Street, but I never actually knew that they were talking about this community in Tulsa. Police, come take my black card.
That's what it's all about. Guns and butter, baby.
What's up? I heard y'all was looking for me to give y'all part 2. I know y'all been patiently waiting at this dinner table for me to come back and tell y'all what happened to Brandi and her 3 kids. So with that being said, let's get right to it. I'm going to give y'all a quick recap so that we can refresh our memories on what happened in last week's episode. So on November 19th, 2010, right before Thanksgiving, 27-year-old Brandi Peters, her 6-year-old twin daughters, Tamaya and Tanaya Peters, and her 3-year-old son, Javante, were found brutally murdered in their home. So Brandi was beaten to death, and not only that, but the investigators also discovered 8 gunshot wounds in her. And one of her twin daughters, Tamaya, was actually shot as well. But the other 2 kids, Tanaya and her 3-year-old son, Javante, were drowned in the tub. So at this point, the detectives have no leads in this case. There's no suspects, and the DNA samples that were collected at Brandi's house, they were supposed to be back within days. But at this time, a good 5 months have gone by. And still, none of the DNA evidence that was collected from Brandi's house has been able to connect anybody to the murders. And so far, the detectives have only interviewed 3 people: Brandi's first baby dad and father of the twins, Antonio Anthony; her second baby dad and father of 3-year-old Javante, Henry Segura. So Henry had an alibi for the morning the bodies were discovered. So he tells the detectives that he was with his friend named Silas Thornton. So they actually bring Silas in for questioning as well. So the reason why Silas was interviewed was because the detectives ended up finding this mystery phone, and this mystery phone pinged right at Brandi's house the day of the murders. And this phone actually originally belonged to Silas. But when Silas gets in there, he tells him that Henry Segura is now the new owner of this phone. So earlier in the investigation, the detectives find out that Henry is married, but he's a certified fuck nigga. And he got about 3 girlfriends on the side with babies, and he just running around Florida slanging dick. So 10 days into the investigation, Henry Segura is brought back into the police station so that he can be re-questioned because he's their number 1 suspect right now. So of course, when he's getting interrogated, he's denying everything, and he's getting caught in lie after lie. And the biggest lie that he gets caught in is the fact that he has multiple cell phones. But at the moment, there was no evidence that connected him to the crime scene, nor was there any DNA evidence from him in the house. So they had to let him go. So when we last left off, I let y'all know that the district attorney wanted DNA evidence to tie somebody to this crime in order to get a conviction. But after months of hitting dead ends and having no real suspects in this case, detectives finally feel like they have a good suspect within their grasp. And the reason they feel like they have a good solid suspect with this person is because after months of hitting dead ends with this case, they finally catch a break. So being that Henry Segura is the prime suspect, they reached all the way into his past, and they ended up finding an old friend of his from middle school named Calvin Moore. Now he has a military background, and he seems like he's a pretty straightforward dude. So like Henry, he is also a welder. So Calvin tells detectives that leading up to the murders, he was actually away in Afghanistan working on a contracting job. But when he comes home, he's in a whole nother tax bracket. And of course, he wants to tell his homeboy Henry about all this money that can be made overseas working contracting jobs. So, he's sharing all the wealth and sharing all the knowledge with Henry. And he tells him, bruh, you need to apply to these jobs overseas. That's where the six-figure money is. And Henry and his wife are all for this. But the only catch with this is, since you're going to be going overseas, of course you need your passport. I don't know if y'all know anything about child support and passports. So if you already have a passport and you're behind on your child support, your passport ends up getting flagged and you won't be able to use it. But if you don't already have one and you try to get it, you won't be able to get one. And it's at this time when the little sad violin starts to play in the back of Henry's head. Because not only does Henry owe child support, but he's actually in the rear a good $30,000. And because of this little child support situation, this six-figure job overseas is now looking a little out of reach for Henry. So not only did investigators just find out all this new information on Henry, Calvin also tells them that he's seen Henry with a .32 caliber revolver in the past, which is the same type of gun that was used in the murders. So that right there just sealed the deal for them. And based off that information, they believe that Henry was the person that committed the murders. And despite them not finding any DNA evidence related to Henry at the crime scene, a weapon was never recovered. No blood was ever found on Henry, in his clothing, on his shoes, in his house, or in his car. But they do have evidence that his burner phone pinged at Brandi's house during the time frame that the murders were suspected to occur. And based off everything that they just heard from his childhood friend Calvin, plus all the information that they already gathered on him, they believed that Henry had the means, the motive, and the opportunity to commit these murders. So 10 months after the murders took place, on September 2nd, 2011, they track Henry down working a job in Minnesota. They snatch his ass up and finally arrest him. And he's charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder, and they ship his ass back to Tallahassee so that he can stand trial. Okay, so the crime took place in 2010. Henry wasn't arrested until 2011. But 7 judges and 9 delays later, on July 31st, 2017, Henry's trial finally begins. He was actually the longest serving inmate in Leon County Jail history. And the reason why it took them so long to try him was because in October of 2015, the trial gets halted because the courts end up finding out that the Florida Department of Law Enforcement violated evidence disclosure rules, meaning that they never said anything about anybody else's DNA being found at the crime scene. So we all know that Henry's DNA wasn't there. But in 2013, they ended up getting a hit on one of the DNA samples that was collected from a phone cradle found in Brandi's room. And this DNA ended up being a partial match to an international drug trafficker named Angel Antonio Avila Quinones. So basically what happened was the Florida Department of Law Enforcement ended up reaching out to the FBI because they just needed some more resources to help them solve this case. So the FBI came in and they tested all the evidence from the crime scene, but they didn't get a hit until 2013. And when they found a partial match in their database that matched this Angel Avila guy, they went back to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement and they recommended that they get some additional samples from this Colombian drug runner. And instead of doing this, the chief of forensics named Karen Martin ends up making the executive decision not to do what the FBI said. And not only that, but she told her team not to disclose this match with the Attorney General or the investigators working on Brandi's case. And she says the reason why she made that decision was because the DNA match was below the standard to be interpreted. So Henry's defense argues that there are 16 million people in the FBI database, and y'all got a hit matching this drug dealer, and you still have my client sitting in jail? That's reasonable doubt right there. So during the trial, of course, that's where all this newfound evidence gets brought into discovery. Cousins, when I tell you, when I first started researching this case, I had no idea what I was in for. But since I decided to come down this rabbit hole, y'all gotta come with me. So in the words of Debo, stop being a bitch and come on. And this case gets so weird during the trial. It takes so many twists and turns. It's going to leave you thinking, did Henry actually do it? Or is the defense's theory true about somebody else doing it? Let's get into this trial so that we can find out what happens next. So the prosecution kicks off the trial by presenting all of the gruesome photos taken from the crime scene. And these pictures show just how bad Brandi's injuries were. All of her fingers were broken, and her fake nails were found scattered around the house, showing that she was fighting for her life and for her kids. Along with the photos, they also present all of the bloody clothing that the victims were wearing. The prosecution really wanted the jury to understand just how gruesome this crime was. So the state believed that the motive behind Henry killing Brandi and her children was due to Henry being in over his head with these child support payments and being in the rear $20,000. Now listen to this mess, cousins. So if y'all remember from last episode, I told y'all that Henry was telling one of his ex-girlfriends that he didn't even think Vontae was his. And the reason why he believed that Vontae wasn't really his was because every time Brandi got mad at him, she would tell him that he wasn't his baby. But when she needed some money or she wanted him to drop that dick off, she'd be like, you know this your baby. But about 2 months prior to the murders, Brandi ended up finally taking Henry to court for child support. But in order to put him on child support, she had to prove that Vontae was his. So they ended up doing a paternity test, and the results, along with the letter stating that he was in the rear $20,000. And not only that, but he was now ordered to pay $825 a month in child support to Brandi. So this information was sent to his home, and the state believes that it was his wife who actually opened up the articles of mail. So Henry's wife already knew about Javante and Brandi, but now she's finding out that he owes all this back child support. And not only that, but now he got to start paying this woman $820 a month. So now his spot has been blown up. And not only that, but he now has Brandi taunting him, telling him if he don't start paying her, she gonna take him to jail and all types of bullshit. So the state says because of all of this, this was his motive to kill Brandi. The state also presents evidence that not only is he having to pay child support for Vontae, but he also has a 6-year-old daughter in Orlando who he's paying child support for as well. And he was already in the rear $10,000 for her. The state then brings forward this man's bank statements. And it shows that at the time of the murders, he only had about $106 in his account. And they also say that Henry wasn't even working at the time, so he was in a bind, Nate. The state then says, you see, Henry was trying to get out of paying Brandi all this money in child support, plus he was in the rear $20,000, so that right there proves he had motive. He also had a way inside of her house because she knew who he was and she trusted him. So there goes his opportunity. And he had access to guns to carry out the crime. So there go your means. So Henry's defense lawyer, Nathan Prince, he comes out swinging. He said, Henry is not the person that did this. And he brings forward an affidavit written in 2016 from James Santos. And y'all remember James Santos. He was the 5-star elite Vice Lord gang member who was writing Brandi from prison. And this is where shit starts to get weird. In this written affidavit, Santos implicates 2 men from the cartel who were responsible for killing Brandi and her kids. And he says the reason why she was killed was because she worked as a drug mule for the Vice Lords from 2004 to 2007. But in 2010, the cartel ended up finding out that Brandi had scammed over $90,000 worth of cocaine off the top, and she was supposedly in a lot of trouble. So he says in the days leading up to her murder, he was actually writing her letters to let her know that her and her kids were in danger. And to back up Santos's claim, Henry's defense actually ends up speaking with one of Brandi's old friends named Lakeisha. And she knew Brandi from her old neighborhood before Brandi moved to her new home on Saddle Creek Run. And she tells his defense that Brandi was a drug dealer, and she witnessed with her own 2 eyes Brandi selling cocaine. Not only that, but it was also rumored that Brandi was selling drugs for other drug dealers as well. But she wasn't paying none of them folks back for the drugs that she was getting. Okay, back to Santos. He then tells them that he was writing letters to Brandi all the way up until the day before she was murdered. And he says that he was trying to negotiate a way for her to pay back all this money, but ultimately, he was the one that put the hit out on her and her kids. Now that does make a little bit of sense. being that they found this partial DNA match to a cartel member found in Brandi's room on her phone cradle that was ripped from the wall. And then listen to this, cousin. They also found an unknown woman's DNA under Brandi's fingernails. And the defense actually brings forward a cartel expert. And this expert testifies that in a lot of cartel hits, they'll actually use a woman to approach the victim to seem trustworthy, and then the men will come in and ambush the victim. And this makes sense because Brandi's home showed no sign of forced entry. So the defense says Henry couldn't have done this. It was multiple people that did this. And now we find DNA evidence from an unknown woman. Combined with this, we have a written affidavit from James Santos stating that he was the one that put the hit out on Brandi and her kids because she was a drug mule skimming money off the top. Therefore, the cartel is the one who's responsible for these murders, not Henry Segura. And last but not least, Henry is able to take the stand in his defense, and he's finally able to describe his version of what happened. And he admits to lying in the beginning about having multiple phones and about having multiple women. But he says the only reason why he lied was because he didn't want this information to get back to his wife. And at the time, he didn't think that lying to the detectives in order to keep information from getting back to his wife and overall to protect his marriage would implicate him in these murders. But he goes on to tell the jury that he and Brandi broke up when Javante was only 6 months old. Now, they had broken up, but they was definitely still messing around. He says that every time he would go out of town for a work trip, when he came back into town, he was dropping dick off. And not only just to Brandi, but at least 3 other women that he was seeing ongoing. But that didn't even account for the women that he was seeing on just one-time flings. He tells the jury that he didn't drink or do drugs, but having extramarital affairs was definitely his drug of choice. But he says he really was trying to do better for his wife, Malika. He says that his wife gave birth to their son prematurely, and he had made a promise to God that if he saved his son, he would never cheat again. His son ended up surviving, and he was doing good. He wasn't cheating on his wife, but after 8 months, he broke his promise to God, and he started cheating again. Lord, and then listen to this. Shortly after he started back cheating, his baby ended up passing away from lung complications. Now, all of this occurred about a year before the murders took place. And he says at that time, he and Brandi were not messing around. But because they lived so close to one another, they would occasionally run into each other while they were dropping their kids off at school. But on November 16th, just 3 days before the murders took place, he and Brandi coincidentally ran into each other at a fast food restaurant. And usually if they bump into one another, they keep it cordial. But for some reason, on this occasion, she was pissed. And she confronted him and asked him why he doesn't come over and see Vontae. And when is he going to start giving her some money for him and all types of stuff. Not only that, but in Henry's words, he says that after seeing him at the drive-thru, she starts doing something that he calls psychotexting. But she was texting his main phone. So he doesn't want to piss her off any further, and he figures the best thing that he can do is to go over the next day and see Javante and to give her some money so that she can get off his back. So he texts her to set up this arrangement so that he can come over on the 17th, which is that Wednesday, and come over and see Javante. So he comes over, he plays with Javante, he gives her some money, and they end up talking about the child support situation. And just like a baby father, he tell her, look, girl, as soon as I get back on my feet and start getting these better paying jobs, I'm going to be able to pay you more consistently on these child support payments. So just be patient with me, all right, little mama? So after he leaves, everything is smooth. Everything's good. She's not upset anymore. She even texts him the next day on Thursday and told him, man, you look good. If you wasn't already my baby daddy, we would have been fucking. And neither the defense or the prosecution had any disputes when it came to these text messages. And just like a nigga, Henry takes this opportunity to entertain the text messages that Brandi just sent and flirt back. So they get to flirting and texting back and forth, and he ends up trying to pull up right then and there. But she was busy, so they ended up making plans to meet up that Friday before she had to go out of town to meet up with her family for the Thanksgiving holiday. So phone records show that he and Brandi had spoke on his burner phone for an hour that Thursday making arrangements so that he can come over and see her before she went out of town. So she texts him back and says, pull up whenever. And he's all for it. But he lives close by, and his sister lives even closer to Brandi than he does. And he didn't want to get caught cheating because his truck is pretty distinctive. So the way he pulls up on Brandi is he parks behind her house in a church parking lot, and then he walks up the little side road, and then he's able to clearly see her house. So that day, he says he parks at the church and he walks up the road. But when he peeks around the corner, he doesn't see her car outside. So he calls her and she answers and tells him that she's not home at the moment. She's out with her mom. So at this time, he walks back to the church parking lot, gets back in his truck, and then goes over to his sister's house to hang out and pass some time until Brandi gets home. So he lets the jury know that he was at his sister's house for maybe about an hour before Brandi finally calls him and tells him that she's going to go pick up the kids, but as soon as she picks him up, meet her back at her house. So at around 3 p.m., he does the same thing all over again. He parks the truck at the church parking lot, walks down, and when he peeks around the corner, he sees that Brandi's mom's truck is parked in her driveway. But of course, because Brandi's mom was not a fan of his, he hurries up and gets out of there. He walks back to his truck in the church parking lot and then sits in the parking lot for about 45 minutes listening to music and watching videos on his phone. So after he sits in his car for about 45 minutes, he sees Brandi's mom drive by leaving her house. So he takes this as a perfect opportunity to head back to her house. And he knows it's about 5 o'clock because he actually called his son to see if he had made it home from an after-school program that day. So when he gets over to Brandi's house, she tells him that the kids are across the street playing at a neighbor's house. So they ended up having sex. It lasted about 20 minutes. After they had sex, the kids ended up coming back home, running in and out of the house. And he actually got the chance to see Javante. They hung out for a little bit, watched a little bit of TV. And Brandi was actually on the phone talking to her sister at this time. So at this time, it's about 8 o'clock. He's finally like, okay, it's getting late. I got to go home. And she's pretty much like, golly, finally, I got some company coming over. I was waiting for you to leave. So they joke around a little bit and he leaves. At this time, he said it's a little bit after 8 o'clock and he makes it home around 9:30 that night. After he makes it home, he says he never went back over to Brandi's house. So I explained to y'all all of that because that was his justification for why his burner phone pinged at Brandi's house during the time frame that they suspected the murders occurred. So yeah, he lives about 5 minutes away and they can't really account for why it took him so long to be active on his main phone again. So that's how they figured out what time he made it back home, because he left his main phone at home. So he says, yeah, I lied about this situation, but the only reason why I lied was because I didn't want this coming back to my wife, Malika. And I honestly didn't think that me lying about this situation was going to get me convicted of murder. So both the prosecution and defense say that both Brandi and Henry's phones were inactive during the time frames between 6:53 and 7:36 p.m. And Henry says this is during the time that they were having sex. But after 8:21, Brandi's phone was never active again. He goes on to say that, yes, I was on child support and I was behind, but at the time of his arrest, he was making more than $10,000 a month working in Minnesota. And that was normal for him. So he knew he would be back on his feet making big bucks. And he even let Brandi know that. He even says that he went 2 times to move the child support process along so that Brandi can stay off of his case. You see, he already knew how this child support process went. So he knew if he showed the judge receipts of how much money he spent on his child during their life, the judge will be able to reduce his payments and then ultimately get some of the back child support knocked off as well. But he continues to tell the jury that he was in Javante's life from the moment he was born, and he loved his son. Henry's defense also throws in another piece of evidence. They let the jury know that 2 of Brandi's neighbors come forward and say they seen 2 cars that were parked in Brandi's driveway that did not belong to her. So his defense rests by saying there was multiple murderers in this case, and not one of them was Henry Segura. The reason why Brandi and her children were murdered was because there was a hit put out on her by James Santos due to her involvement dealing drugs for the Los Zadas Mexican cartel. So after both sides rested, it was time for the jury to deliberate. And after 19 hours, they still could not decide if Henry was guilty or not. Henry's defense team knew he was going to get acquitted for this. But after the 19 hours, they came out with the hung jury, 11-1. So the judge declared a mistrial. And I don't know if y'all know what a mistrial means. It means you have to redo the entire trial all over again. So 2 years later, in 2019, they presented this case in front of a jury once again. So they presented all the same evidence, all the witnesses, just like they did in the first trial. But the one thing that's different in this trial is instead of using James Santos's written affidavit, he actually comes forward and takes the stand. Okay, so once again, he tells the jury that Brandi was a drug mule for the Vice Lord gang. And because he was the one that brought her in and introduced her to the cartel, when they found out that she was stealing money from them, they said that he had to be the one that was responsible for carrying out the hit on her. So he says he got 2 guys from Texas and Atlanta to help him pull off this hit. And he tells the jury the letters he was writing to Brandi were coded. And to the naked eye, nobody would know what he was referring to. But he says he was negotiating a way for Brandi to repay her debt. Y'all, this shit gets so weird. He says in this negotiation, Brandi was supposed to pay back $50,000 and then do one last run with the car that was waiting for her in Atlanta. Like, what the fuck is going on right now? But James tells the jury that even if Brandi had followed his directions and done what the negotiation said, she was still going to be killed because the cartel couldn't trust her anymore. He was just trying to recoup some of the money that she stole. But this shit just sounds insane, doesn't it? The state argued that James is not a reliable witness and he cannot be trusted, and he suffers from a personality disorder. And he be lying about doing things that we know he's never done before. Now, the defense does bring a psychologist forward, and they did say that he was fit to testify on this trial, and he had no mental disorder. So the state refutes this. With this same psychologist, they say, yes, James is fit to testify in this trial, but he's sure enough a pathological liar. He was in there lying about simple shit like where he was born. So how easy could it be for him to make all of this up? Because if he was the one that ordered the hit on Brandi and they knew this before the trial took place, then why the hell is Henry even on trial? So I think everybody was in agreement that James really wasn't a reliable witness and he had a few issues. So they wrapped up all the testimony and both sides rested once again. Oh, and I forgot to tell y'all that in this trial, Henry's defense ended up getting a 6-person jury instead of a 12-person jury. So after only 3.5 hours, the jury comes out with the verdict. And on November 19, 2019, Henry Segura was found guilty of all 4 counts of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison. That was dragged the fuck out. I'm sorry, but I had to give y'all all the details of this case. If y'all stuck with me throughout this entire case, I love y'all, and that's why y'all my favorite cousins. Y'all leave me a review on whatever platform you're listening on. Let me know what you think of the case. Do you think Henry Segura was the one that committed the murders? Or was the state just reaching for somebody to convict? Or do you think it was the cartel?
That's what it's all about. Guns